Hi everybody, this is Joy at Red Pine Quilt Shop. Today we are talking about working with blocks where the block components are set on point and how to do some things to make sure that you get a better quality block in the end, and we'll also talk about squaring those blocks up. So the blocks that I'm talking about are blocks like this square and a square block where you have a component of the block that is set on point. And they are sometimes a little more challenging to deal with than blocks that are just basic squares, rectangles, half square triangles, etc. when you have these elements set on point. So the first thing that you want to pay attention to in your pattern is how are these basically block setting pieces being cut. We want to make sure that when we're cutting pieces like this, that we are keeping straight of grain fabric on the outer edge of our block. So a setting triangle like this should be cut from a square. So this was a square of fabric and it was split on the diagonal, so we have straight of grain on those perimeter areas. So if I was going to use a square like this as a setting triangle on a block, I have that straight of grain on the outer edges that I'm looking for. And my bias is here, which is going to be internal to the block. And that will help you a lot in getting a nice square block when you finish sewing it, because you're keeping that bias to the inside and you don't have it on the outer edges where it's going to start to distort and give you a funky block. Now the next block that we're going to look at is a more challenging block. It's got a little more going on, and this is the granny square block, another classic quilt block design. Again, has elements set on point throughout the block. So for this block, you are dealing with two different kinds of setting pieces. You have setting pieces that go into the corners, and you have setting pieces that go along the side edges. And again, we want to make sure that we're cutting this so that we have straight of grain fabric around that outer edge of the block. And if we do that, that will help us to have a nice square block that isn't misshapen, isn't distorted, and is coming out at the correct size, because we're not stretching fabric in there. So these corner pieces, just like that square and a square block, you want to see those being cut from a square, split once on the diagonal like this. That way we have straight of grain here and here, here and here, bias here, and the bias is what's getting sewn to your block, and you're keeping those straight of grain edges on the outside perimeter of the block. When we get to these setting triangles though, and there's two on each side all the way around, those we want to have straight of grain here. So they need to be cut from a larger square that is bisected twice on both diagonals. So that will give you those pieces where you have straight of grain here and here and here and here. So when we sew those into the block, again, we're keeping straight of grain along the outside edges. So if you have a pattern that is well written, that is how they should have you cutting those corner and side setting triangles. If you have a pattern that does not have you cutting them that way, you might want to consider seeing if you have enough fabric to change it up and cut them in that fashion, because cutting them that way will help a lot in having you come up with a nice square block. So the next thing that I want to talk about is pressing. So we cut those pieces to keep straight of grain on the outside edges of our block, and now when we are going to start to sew them on, we want to consider that as well when we're pressing. So this little triangle is going to be right there. It's that little triangle going on that block. So these do need to be centered up before you go to sew them. You want to center them on that black fabric. Now, if you have a challenging time eyeballing those, you do have a couple options. I'm going to show you a couple tools that will let you square that corner off. And this is one of those tools, but the one thing that you want to think about is how to place this so that you get this placed correctly. So you want to make sure you think about it, maybe sew one block first. So this tool placed like this, lined up with the edge and lined up there, would allow you to trim that corner. And same thing you can do on the other side as well, but you have to think about your placement a little bit to make sure that you're trimming the corner off at the correct angle. And this is the dog ear clipper tool from It's So Emma. Very simple little tool. The other tool that is a nice tool for pre-trimming those corners, if you would like to trim them in advance, is the Creative Grids folded corner clipper. And this comes in a small and a large size, but sometimes for a lot of people it's a little easier if they trim the pieces off first, or at least for a while, and then you might get a little better able to eyeball them. But this tool placed like this would allow you to trim that dog ear off. And if you trim them off ahead of time, you don't have to, what I call eyeballing, to make sure that you're getting it centered up. You want to have, roughly the same amount of fabric extending from either side. And then you go ahead and you sew your 1/4 inch seam. Now, after you have sewn your seam, for this particular block, you're going to press it out towards the triangle. So when you looked at your triangle pieces, remember we cut a square, we split it on the diagonal. Our straight of grain is here and here. So if I laid that piece there, my bias is along that edge where I just sewed the seam. So you want to keep that in mind when you go to press. If you flip that and you just press like this right into all that bias, you are going to stretch that triangle and distort it. So when you press something like this, you want to think about always pressing along the straight of grain of the fabric. So I would press this like this, and I would press it like this, and that'll open this side of the seam up, and that'll open this side of the seam up. Either that, or be careful to not move your iron. But if there is going to be any motion to your iron, it needs to follow the straight of grain, which is right here and right here, right here and right here. You don't want to press right into the middle like that, because that will stretch. So straight of grain, follow the straight of grain, follow the straight of grain. When I was doing these blocks, I actually was pressing them twice. I would press this way, and then I would do a rotate the block quick and press this way, and it opened all my seams up nicely with no distortion. So keep that in mind when you are sewing those squares on. After you've sewn the square on, we're basically making a sub-assembly like this to go on the side of the block. So after you've sewn that corner square on, the next thing you need to do is to add kind of the 2 wings. So you need to add those next. So now keep in mind, these were the pieces that were cut from the larger square bisected twice. So for these pieces, my straight of grain is right here. There was my straight of grain. That piece placed in, my straight of grain is there. So after you sew that onto your block, and you want to make sure when you're sewing these on, you're lining that edge up and sewing this way. And when you look at that, it's going to look at a little goofy. You're going to say, boy, that's way more than 1/4 inch. Thing you have to keep in mind with these blocks is you need to have 1/4 inch off of that point. So it is going to be more than 1/4 inch following the seam allowance, because you need to have 1/4 inch on the diagonal. So it's going to look long, but it's going to be okay. And sometimes patterns will have you make these oversized. So do make sure you know if it's being intentionally made oversized, which it might be, and then you can trim it off when you square up. But for this particular piece of fabric, again, I don't want to press this way, because I have bias here and I have bias here. I want to follow that long length of the wing. So when I press these pieces, I come like this and I press like that. And as long as I'm following the straight of grain, I can have a little motion with my iron without causing issues. Otherwise, you've got to just truly be pressing and not moving your iron. I have a hard time not moving my iron because I feel like if I don't, I leave puckers in the seams. But follow the straight of grain if you do have any motion in your iron. So when I ironed this one, I just followed straight along that outside edge. So you want to follow that edge. That is your straight of grain. If you follow that with your iron, there's not going to be much stretch in that. And you'll end up with a nice piece that you can put on your block that won't have distortion in it right away when you're starting. So when you end up with a block like this or a block like this, you do want to check them when you're done and get them squared up. So what I like to use just to spot check my corners, or possibly to do my trimming if it's big enough, I like to use the 6.5 by 12.5 inch ruler from Creative Grids. And what I like about this ruler is the fact that it has a dashed line showing me where my 1/4 inch seam is going to land. And it has this little connection crosshair of 45-degree lines. So this is my favorite ruler to spot check blocks because I can line that little crosshair up on my seams and I can pretty quickly get a sense of how I did on my blocks. I can line that up, I can line that up, I can get that little crosshair right at the edge of my block, and I can easily see what I have to trim. So generally what I do is I spot check a few of my corners, I see how things are looking. When I'm making blocks like this, I will always sew one first before I chain piece a whole bunch of them, so I can make sure that things are working out okay and my blocks are coming together nicely. So I'll spot check a few of my intersections, make sure they look like they're pretty good. And then the other thing that I will do before I start cutting anything is to check the entire size of my block. So I'll take my ruler and I'll look at my entire block size, flip my ruler around here so I can read it, and I'll line a 1/4 inch up there, I'll line a dash 1/4 inch up on another side. This block is an odd size because of the sizing of the pieces that I used, but I'll get a sense of how, this is actually a 6 1/8 inch block is what it should be, but I'll get a sense of how my block is looking, if my block is looking pretty good. When I start to trim a block like this, if my block is pretty close to the size that it should be, and when I say pretty close, I mean within 1/8 of an inch. 1/8 of an inch I can deal with if I'm off 1/8 of an inch, as long as I don't have any more substantial sizing issue. What I will normally do is pay attention to my points, and I will trim to make my points good. Now, if you have a block that's obviously way too large, way too big, if it's a block that was designed with oversized setting pieces, it may be way too large and you may need to definitely do some trimming down to get it to the correct size. So you have to kind of be aware of that. But if you have a block that's being made to the correct size and it is relatively close to that correct size, I will normally square up, with my focus mostly being on making sure that I'm going to keep my points nicely. So I may end up with a block that's a little bit bigger than it should be or a little bit smaller, not by much. Like I said, 1/8 of an inch or less, but I will worry less about that than I will my points, because if you sew over a point, that gets noticed. If your block is 1/8 of an inch bigger than it should be, especially on this big 13-inch block, you can ease that in and that's going to disappear when it's quilted. So don't lose your points. That's the more important thing to focus on, unless you have a huge sizing issue, in which case you need to address it and go back and see what happened with your piecing. But normally for a little block like this, I will use my crosshair and I will simply straighten up my edges. So you can see here, I don't know if you can get a good angle on that. I can rotate this a little bit. You can see here that I have a piece that's a little bit larger. The piece here is pretty much right at the edge of my ruler where it should be, but this piece is out. So I would trim that off. I would of course get rid of my dog ears. So I would trim my way around, and I would probably go side by side and just make sure that I'm getting it set so that my pieces. Now, as you rotate the ruler though, do be watching. You don't want to trim your block into something that's not square. So be watching for that as well, but definitely focus on those points. Now, this block is a big enough block that I can spot check my points with this ruler, but it's not long enough to square this a whole block edge up here. But I still do go to that little crosshair point from a standpoint of quickly checking my point placement, especially if I think I have one that's too big or too shallow. It's a quick way to check. So find a ruler that you have that has that crosshair in it. For this block though, that is a 13-inch block finishing to 12.5, I do have to go to my big square. And what I would do on this one is focus on my 1/4-inch marks, try to line my 1/4-inch marks up, and then I would get ready to trim. Now, for a block like this, I will try to trim 2 sides at once if I can, but if I'm finding that I can't get my points to line up well to do that, I will again go side by side if I need to, and I will be more focused on keeping that 1/4 inch from the corner to the edge of the fabric than I will on cutting it to exactly the right size or to an exact perfect square, especially on a large block like this, because if it's off just a tad, it's not perfectly square, or it's slightly bigger or slightly smaller, I can address that when I can put the blocks together. It's not so much that I can adjust, and that will be less noticeable than lopping off one of my corner points. So you kind of have to, for some of these, if your blocks are a little off, see here, I'm definitely going to cut this block a little bit big, because if I left a 1/4 inch on both sides, I would lop off the point on this one if I cut this at 13 inches. So I'm going to cut it a little bigger. I'm going to probably cut this block at about 13 1/8. Because I don't want to lose my points. And when I start making more blocks, I'll see, and generally what you're going to find is they're going to all be a little bit bigger if you, and it's just how you're piecing. I may be running with a little bit of a shallow seam allowance, but you can adjust for those things. So focus on your points. That's the most critical thing when you're squaring these blocks up. You don't want to be lopping those things off when you sew them into this. By sewing your point into, you won't cut it off, but you'll lose it when you sew it into the seam allowance if you end up trimming, so that you're not at least a 1/4 inch away from these points. So you want to make sure you keep that 1/4 inch from the point. And remember, it's 1/4 inch on the diagonal. So a 1/4 inch away, not a 1/4 inch following the seam, but a 1/4 inch over, that you need to make sure you have so you don't sew it into your seam allowance. So those are my tips and tricks on working with blocks that have elements set on point. I truly think that if you focus on making sure that you're cutting so you have straight a grain at the edges, adapt the cutting instructions if you need to on a pattern, and that you are pressing, following the straight of grain, I think you're going to find that your blocks are going to come out really well, and that's going to make your whole task of squaring them up much easier. So thanks for joining us today. If you're interested in either the folded corner clipper or the dog ear clipper tool from It's So Emma, you can find both of them on our website at www.redpinequiltshop.com. Thanks for joining us today.